Paper cup was beginning to bend beneath my fingers. Hadn't noticed how tightly I was holding it until a thin line of water slipped over the rim and landed on the polished table. One mentioned it. Across from me sat a woman from Damp named Priya Shah. She had introduced herself as a fraud prevention specialist, though there was nothing cold or official in her manner. She spoke quietly, as though raising her voice might make the situation worse. Beside her lay a printed transfer request. 18,750. The figure looked far larger on paper than it had on the screen at home. Priya rested one hand beside the document. Mr. Mercer, we're not refusing the payment at this stage. We're asking you to delay it while we confirm who will receive the money. I've already told you who it's for. Voice sounded sharper than I intended. Claire isn't a stranger. James was sitting beside me, his coat still damp from the rain outside. Driven over from Leeds. After turning up at my house and finding the transfer paperwork on the kitchen counter. Priya gave a small nod. How long have you known her? Nearly 3 months. And you've met in person? Not yet. The answer seemed to hang in the room. Looked down at my hands. We speak every morning and every night. She knows more about me than most people do. James shifted slightly in his chair, but said nothing. She knows how Margaret took her tea, I continued. Weak, one sugar, though she'd always pretend she didn't want the sugar. My throat tightened. She knows. I still keep Margaret's dressing gown behind the bedroom door, because I haven't had the heart to move it. Priya's expression didn't change. She knows Sundays are difficult for me, because Margaret and I always walk together on Sundays. Rain or shine. Heard the strain creeping into my own voice. You don't learn things like that about someone if you don't care. No one argued. Somehow made me feel more foolish. I looked towards James. He wasn't angry now. That was worse. He looked frightened. Frightened of Claire. Frightened for me. Dad, he said. We're not saying your feelings aren't real. My feelings have got nothing to do with this transfer. They've got everything to do with it. I turned away from him. Priya slid the paper a little closer to herself. The receiving account isn't in Claire's name. She explained that. It's held by someone called M. Okafor, her legal representative. Have you spoken to that person? No. Seen any official identification? Claire sent me her passport. James' surname was covered. I felt heat rising to my face. It was partly covered by her thumb. That doesn't mean anything. Priya picked up her pen but didn't write. Mr. Mercer, is Claire's full legal name? I looked at her. For some reason, the question irritated me. Claire. I understand. Her surname? I opened my mouth. Nothing came. James slowly took my mobile phone from the table. He placed it between us. The screen showing Claire's profile photograph. Silver blonde hair. A gentle smile. A cardigan buttoned neatly at the neck. Face. I'd looked at every morning for weeks. James spoke more softly this time. Dad, what is Claire's surname? The room seemed to lose all sound. I stared at the photograph, searching my memory. Claire M. on the friendship website. Claire on WhatsApp. Claire at the bottom of every email. No full name. No proper address. No solicitor. I'd spoken to myself. Told her about Margaret's illness, my fear of dying alone, the money I'd saved, my house, my son, my grandchildren. Had given a woman my grief, my home address and nearly £10,000 already. And I couldn't say her surname. Priya moved the transfer request out of my reach. We need you not to send this money today. I wanted to tell them they were wrong. I wanted Claire to ring at that exact moment and explain everything in the calm, tired voice I'd come to trust. But my phone remained silent. The truth is, my story didn't begin with 18,750. It didn't begin in a bank, my son watching. me realize how little I knew about the woman I believed I loved. It began on a cold November evening, with an untouched dinner, an empty chair, and a notification glowing on my tablet. Had a man who spent 40 years checking every railway signal twice trusted a woman whose surname he did not even know. 4 years before that afternoon at the bank, Margaret died after 38 years of marriage. People say a house feels different when someone is gone. That is true, but not in the way I once imagined. The walls do not change. Furniture stays where it was. The clock still ticks. What changes is the meaning of everything inside it. I remained in our semi-detached house in Haworth because living felt impossible. Margaret and I had bought it when James was still small. We had replaced the kitchen twice, argued over wallpaper, planted roses that never quite behaved, spent countless evenings saying we ought to move somewhere easier to maintain. After she died, could not bear the thought of another family living among those memories. So the house stayed almost exactly as she had left it. Cookbooks remained on the kitchen shelf, their pages marked with flour and little notes in the margins. Gardening gloves still rested on the shelf in the conservatory, stiff with dried soil. I kept meaning to throw them away. I never did. My shopping habits refused to change. Every week I bought a 2-pint bottle of milk, though I rarely finished it before it turned sour. For nearly 40 years, 2 pints had been the right amount. My hands seemed unable to accept that one person needed less. From the outside, 3 days probably appeared full enough. I went to the supermarket once a month, attended lunch with a few retired railway men at a pub near the station. We spoke about old colleagues, poor delayed trains and the foolish decisions of younger managers. I walked beside the river Foss when the weather was decent, the Sunday evening. "How are you doing, Dad?" "Fine, keeping busy, always." That answer became automatic. Truth was that routines filled hours, not lives. There were gaps between everything. Long gaps. Hardest part of the day began shortly after 5 o'clock. The shops grew quieter. The daylight faded. Curtains closed across the street. Warm yellow lights appeared in the neighbors' windows. I could hear families arriving home, car doors, children calling upstairs, one laughing next door. The sounds came through the walls softly enough that I could pretend not to listen. Most evenings, we heated something simple and ate it in front of the television, a pie soup, occasionally fish from the freezer. Kept the plate balanced on my knees and watched programs Margaret and I once enjoyed together. Though without her beside me, they felt strangely pointless. Sometimes I left the radio playing upstairs. Not because I wanted to hear it, simply liked the sense that another room was occupied. James invited me to Leeds for Christmas every year. "You know you're always welcome." I know. "The children would love it. I don't want to disrupt your plans." "You wouldn't." But I imagined their busy house, James and his wife trying to prepare dinner, the grandchildren coming and going, me sitting in the corner, while everyone quietly adjusted their arrangements around the widowed father. So I told him I preferred being independent. In truth, I was afraid of becoming a burden. One November evening, my neighbor invited me to her birthday gathering. Everyone was perfectly kind. There was wine, sausage rolls, and far too much cake. But nearly everyone arrived as a couple. They stood close together without noticing it. Person fetched another's coat. Someone whispered that it was time to leave. Husband carried 2 drinks across the room, without needing to ask what his wife wanted. No one excluded me. That almost made it harder. Returned home before 9. The hallway was cold and silent when I stepped inside. Placed my keys in the small ceramic bowl beside the door and waited for a feeling I could not name. Then I realized what was troubling me. No one had said, "Send me a message when you get home." It was such a small thing. Margaret had always said it, even when I was only walking back from the pub. That evening, the absence of those words seemed to fill the whole house. I made tea and sat with my tablet, scrolling through Facebook without taking much in. Then an advertisement appeared. It was for a friendship website aimed at people over 60. The wording was not flashy. There were no pictures of glamorous couples standing on beaches. Just a simple sentence. "Someone may be waiting to hear from you." Nearly closed the page. Then I looked across the room at Margaret's empty chair. Creating a profile felt disloyal at first, as though I were erasing her. I used a photograph James had taken at a family lunch and wrote that I was retired, widowed, fond of walking, old films, railway history and property. Then I waited. For several days, nothing happened. I felt relieved and disappointed. Then, at exactly 9:17 on a rainy Thursday evening, a message appeared. "You have kind eyes. I hope that is not too forward." The sender's name was Claire. I read it twice before answering. What I did not yet understand was why, among all the men on that website, Claire had chosen me. Claire's profile was almost disappointingly ordinary. There were no photographs of luxury hotels, expensive restaurants, or glamorous holidays. Instead, she stood beside an old stone garden wall in one picture, wrapped in a navy cardigan, with a takeaway coffee in her hand. Another showed her looking out towards the sea on what appeared to be a gray autumn afternoon. In a third, she was smiling at someone behind the camera, while carrying a small basket of flowers. She looked like someone I might have passed in York City Center without giving a second glance. Perhaps that was why I trusted the profile so quickly. Her description was equally modest. Widowed 64. Originally from Surrey, retired after many years as a teaching assistant, fond of gardening, detective dramas, to charity shops and quiet seaside towns. Once the tourists had gone home, there was nothing that seemed designed to impress. Finally replied to her message. I kept it short. "Thank you. That's very kind of you." A few minutes later she answered, "Hope I haven't embarrassed you." "Not at all. I nearly didn't write." "So did I." That made her laugh. Or at least she typed that it had. For the next few days, our conversations remained gentle and unhurried. She never asked whether I owned my house. She never asked how much pension I received. She never even asked what I had done for a living until nearly a week later. Instead, she asked about the photograph James had taken. "Your smile looks genuine," she wrote. "Was it a family occasion?" "It was my granddaughter's birthday." Family photographs usually tell you more about someone than any profile ever could. That struck me as an unusually thoughtful thing to say. I told her a little about James and the grandchildren, careful not to share too much. She responded by telling me about her late husband, Peter. According to Claire, he had died 6 years earlier after suffering from a heart condition. "There are still mornings when I forget he's gone," she admitted. "Understand," I replied. I still catch myself making 2 cups of tea. For several minutes she didn't answer. When her next message arrived, it was only one sentence. I thought I was the only person who still did things like that. From that moment, something changed. We stopped feeling like strangers. She remembered details that surprised me. Tuesday, I mentioned I had a hospital appointment for my arthritis. The following morning, before I'd even finished breakfast, message appeared. "How did the appointment go? I hope they weren't running terribly late." I smiled. Most people would have forgotten I'd even mentioned it. A few days later, I told her Margaret had always loved yellow roses. The next afternoon, Claire sent me a photograph of yellow roses climbing over a cottage wall, growing outside the little place. I'm staying. She explained that she was temporarily living in France to settle her late sister's estate. It was supposed to take a few weeks, she wrote. It has become rather more complicated. I asked where she was. Not far from Limoges. The answer seemed oddly vague, but I assumed she simply expected me not to know the area. When I suggested we might try a video call one evening, she apologized. The internet here is dreadful. Instead, she asked whether we could speak by phone. Our first conversation lasted only 12 minutes. Her voice was soft, educated, and carried the slight weariness of someone who had spent years looking after other people. I'm sorry if I sound nervous, she said. Haven't done anything like this before. Neither had I, oddly enough. Her uncertainty reassured me. Someone pretending to be confident might have worried me more. Before we ended the call, she admitted she'd nearly deleted her own profile. Most of the men who wrote to me wanted to rush everything. And I didn't? You asked about my garden. I laughed. It seemed safer than asking about your age. It was. For the first time in years, my evenings began to have shape again. Around 7:30, I'd shave. Even if I hadn't left the house all day. A week later I bought a new navy jumper from Marks & Spencer. Caught my reflection in the changing room mirror. I realized I was making an effort again. Not for vanity. For hope. Told nobody about Claire. Part of me wanted to protect something that still felt fragile. A part of me feared James would think I'd lost my senses. One evening, just before we ended our call, Claire spoke so quietly. I almost missed it. I wish we'd met before life made us both so cautious. After we said goodnight, I lay awake replaying those words. They sounded honest, comforting. Yet there was something I still couldn't ignore. Every time we tried to see each other properly on camera, something interrupted the connection. Was Claire simply protecting a heart that had already been broken? Protecting an identity that could never survive being seen clearly? Over the next 5 weeks, Claire quietly became part of my life, in some dramatic whirlwind way. It happened through the smallest moments. Every morning, just before I switched the kettle on, tablet would light up. Good morning, David. Have you remembered your scarf today? I would smile without meaning to. Not yet. I will now. It became a routine. I looked forward to more than I cared to admit. She always seemed to know the right time to appear. If I mentioned rain was expected, she'd ask whether I'd managed to get out for a walk before it started. If I said my knee was aching, remind me not to overdo things in the garden. Nobody had paid that sort of quiet attention to me since Margaret died. Before long, found myself sending Claire little photographs from my own day. The first frost sparkling across the back garden, Sunday roast that had turned out rather better than expected. York Minster glowing in the late afternoon from one of the quieter side streets. Garrett's old rose bed, where a single yellow bloom had appeared despite the cold. In a model railway carriage, I'd spent 2 afternoons repairing at the dining room table. Each time, Claire replied with genuine interest. You very patient hands. Margaret would be pleased. Those roses are still thriving. I hope one day you'll show me York yourself. There was never any rush. She rarely flirted. Instead, she spoke about companionship. Miss having someone to tell when something completely ordinary happens. She said during one phone call, I boiled the kettle twice this morning because I forgot. I'd already made tea. I laughed. I've done exactly the same. Strange what you miss. No, I replied quietly. It isn't strange at all. She understood something that many people, even those who loved me, couldn't quite see. Loneliness wasn't only about spending evenings alone. It was about having nobody who cared about the tiny things. As the weeks passed, Claire gently asked more about Margaret. Not in a way that felt intrusive. She never compared herself, never tried to replace her. Instead, she asked what Margaret had been like. Found myself telling stories I'd never repeated to anyone else. How we'd first met at a railway social dance. She'd insisted Yorkshire tea tasted better because the water in York was superior. How she'd laughed whenever I became too serious. Eventually, I spoke about the final months of her illness. There was one memory I had carried for 4 years. One afternoon, after another sleepless night at the hospital, Margaret had asked for a glass of water. I remember snapping at her, not loudly, just impatiently. Fetched the water immediately afterwards, apologized and kissed her forehead. She squeezed my hand, as though nothing had happened. After she died, that single moment stayed with me, far more than the thousands of kind things I'd done. I've never forgiven myself, admitted. Claire remained silent for a few seconds. Then she spoke gently. David, being exhausted isn't the same as loving someone less. Closed my eyes. Nobody had ever said those words to me before. Something inside me eased, not completely, but enough. From then on, trusted her with things I'd never even told James. I admitted that Sunday afternoons were the worst, that sometimes I spoke aloud to Margaret while making tea, that I occasionally wondered whether, if something happened to me, anyone would notice for several days. Claire didn't try to dismiss those fears. She simply said, "You won't be alone forever, David." The sentence stayed with me. Before long, we were imagining a future together. She talked about visiting York as soon as everything in France was finished. Planned to walk through the shambles early in the morning before the crowds arrived. Tea near the Minster. Fish and chips in Whitby once spring returned. The first time in years, those plans felt possible without really thinking about why. Began clearing the spare room. Margaret's winter coats went carefully into storage. Some of her clothes were folded into boxes. I told myself it was simply time. Deep down, I knew I was making space for Claire. One evening she sent me a photograph. British passport lay beside an airline itinerary. "Just proving I really do exist," she joked. I looked closely. Most of the passport was visible, except for part of her surname. Her thumb rested neatly across it. I noticed, then immediately felt guilty for noticing. Everyone deserved a little privacy, didn't they? She even told me that someone had once stolen her photographs and created a fake online profile. "It was horrible," she said. "If you ever find my picture somewhere unexpected, that's probably why." At the time, her explanation sounded perfectly reasonable. Answered a question I hadn't even thought to ask. Then, one Saturday afternoon, James arrived without warning. He glanced towards the kitchen, where 2 mugs drying beside the sink. He noticed the new jumper hanging over the chair. He looked towards the spare room and saw boxes stacked neatly against one wall. "You've been busy," he said with a smile. I laughed awkwardly. "Met someone?" His eyebrows lifted. "Really?" For the next half hour, I told him about Claire. When I finally showed him her photograph, studiums. Lovely. Relief washed over me. Then, as he stood to leave, he asked one more question. "Had a proper video call, haven't you?" I felt myself stiffing. "The internet where she's staying is dreadful." James nodded slowly. "I'm sure it probably is." He didn't argue. He simply walked to the front door. Yet something in his expression stayed with me long after he'd driven away. What had James seen in that single photograph that somehow missed after looking at it every day for weeks? After James drove back to Leeds, I stood at the front window for a long while, watching the rain settle on the windscreen of my car. His question stayed with me. "You've had a proper video call, haven't you?" At the time, I'd dismissed it almost immediately. Poor internet, old cottages, rural France. None of those things sounded unusual. Still, once an idea finds its way into your mind, it has a habit of returning when the house grows quiet. The following evening, Claire rang just after 7:30. "How was your day?" she asked cheerfully. "Not bad. James came over yesterday?" "Oh, he knows about us now." There was a brief pause. "What did he think?" "He said you seemed lovely." "I'm relieved. So am I." A few moments we chatted about ordinary things. I'd repaired a loose fence panel. We'd spent most of the afternoon sorting paperwork connected with her sister's estate. Then, almost casually, she said, "We'll probably be traveling into Limoges tomorrow." I smiled. "I thought you said the cottage was only 20 minutes away." "It is." There pause. "Actually, I'm staying closer to Brive now." I frowned slightly. I was almost certain she'd never mentioned Brive before. Perhaps I'd remembered wrongly. After all, I wasn't exactly an expert on French geography. I let it pass. Few days later, she sent me another photograph of the little square where she'd supposedly gone for coffee. Something looked oddly familiar. Then I realized why. The same church appeared behind her, as in a photograph she'd sent the previous week. She'd claimed that one had been taken somewhere entirely different. When I mentioned it, she laughed. "You've got sharper eyes than I have. Probably spend too much time looking at old railway maps. I've never been very good with directions." It sounded perfectly reasonable. Yet a tiny seed of doubt had been planted, not enough to alarm me. Only enough to make me think. Another evening, we were talking on the phone when I heard a man's voice in the background. It wasn't clear enough to make out the words. Just a few seconds of conversation. Claire immediately lowered her own voice. "Oh, I'll have to call you back." Before I could ask why, the line went dead. She didn't ring again until the following morning. "I'm terribly sorry." "What happened?" "Caretaker needed access to the cottage." "I thought you were staying there alone." "I am." "He was just checking the heating." There was nothing impossible about the explanation. Having so, something felt slightly unsettled inside me. Not because of the man, because I had noticed myself searching for reassurance. The following Sunday, she suggested another video call. "Let's try at 3. Spent far longer preparing than I should have. I vacuumed the sitting room, placed fresh flowers from the garden on the coffee table, changed into the new navy jumper I'd bought weeks earlier. At exactly 3 o'clock the call came through. For perhaps 3 seconds I saw her. At least, I thought I did. A blurred face, poor lighting, something that might have been a smile. Then the picture froze. Seconds later, a message appeared. "I'm so sorry. The connections failed again." I could cry, stared at the screen in disappointment. Then, almost immediately felt ashamed of myself. She couldn't help bad internet. Could she? When we finally spoke later that evening, Claire sounded hurt. "I thought you trusted me." "I do. It felt as though you were questioning everything." "I wasn't. I've spent enough years being doubted." Her voice became quieter. "I honestly believed you were different." My stomach sank. "I am. I don't want to become one of those women who's treated as a liar simply because she met someone online. I'm sorry." The apology came far too quickly. Instead of asking more questions, I found myself trying to repair the damage. Following day she hardly contacted me at all. No cheerful morning message, no photograph, no phone call over tea. Checked my tablet far more often than I care to admit. When her message finally arrived late that evening, I needed a little time to think. Felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Only afterwards did I realize something had quietly changed between us. I was no longer waiting for Claire to earn my trust. I was trying to earn hers. A couple of evenings later, James rang. "Dad, how's everything going?" "Very well." "When exactly is Claire coming home?" "Soon." "What town is she in now?" "Near Limoges." "Thought you said she'd moved." "I'm not entirely sure." He hesitated before asking another question. "Who's dealing with her sister's estate?" "Solicitor." "Which one?" "I can't remember." The questions irritated me. Why does it matter? I'm only trying to understand. It feels like you're trying to catch her out. There was a long silence. "I'm trying to protect you." "I don't need protecting." After we ended the call, Claire rang almost immediately, as though she somehow sensed my mood. "I've had some bad news." "What is it?" "The inheritance has become much more complicated." She sounded embarrassed. "There are legal issues. Taxes. My account's being temporarily restricted while everything is reviewed." "I'm sorry. I hate talking about money." "You don't have to. I knew you'd understand." She took a slow breath. "You're the one person I feel I can trust." As I listened to those words, I couldn't help wondering, had Claire finally trusted me with her problem? Or had she been preparing me to solve it? For a long while after that conversation, I sat in my armchair without switching the television on. Claire's words echoed around the quiet house. The one person I feel I can trust. No one had said something like that to me for years. Not because my family didn't care, because they no longer needed me in the way they once had. James had his own family. My grandchildren were growing up. Neighbors managed perfectly well without asking for help. For the first time in a very long while, someone seemed to believe I could still make a real difference to another person's life. The following evening, Claire rang again. "I've been thinking about yesterday." "So have I. I almost didn't tell you about the estate. I didn't want you to think I was bringing problems into your life. You don't. I've spent weeks trying to solve it myself." Her voice sounded tired. "So what's actually happened?" She explained that her late sister had left behind a small house and several personal possessions. The estate had finally been approved. Before anything could be released, there were administrative charges, solicitor's fees, and what she called an inheritance tax adjustment. "It should all be straightforward," she sighed. "But because I'm still in France, bank has temporarily restricted my account while they reviewed the international transactions." I didn't really understand the legal details, but it had been simple when Margaret died. Still, every family was different. Every country had different rules. "I'll manage somehow," Claire said quietly. "I always do." "You don't sound convinced." "I'm trying to be." Then she laughed softly. "Promised myself I wouldn't burden you with any of this. You haven't." "No, David, you've listened to me for weeks. I don't want to become another person asking things from you." The sentence lingered. She still hadn't asked for anything. Instead, she sounded embarrassed, ashamed even. "I only need a few days," she continued. "As soon as the estate is released, everything will be sorted." Without really thinking, I heard myself ask, "How much are we talking about?" There was a long silence. "No, you haven't answered." "Can't. It wouldn't be fair." Eventually, she spoke so quietly, I almost missed it. "About £3,200. It was certainly a great deal of money. But it wasn't beyond my means. Margaret and I had always been careful. We'd paid off the mortgage years earlier. We'd saved whenever we could. Helping someone I loved through a temporary difficulty didn't seem irresponsible. It seemed exactly what couples were supposed to do. "I'll lend it to you." "No, You don't even need to ask. I want to. She refused. Again. Then again, oddly enough, the refusal made me trust her more. If she demanded money immediately, perhaps I would have questioned it. Instead, she seemed almost reluctant. Finally, she whispered, "If you're absolutely certain, I'll repay every penny the moment my account is released. I know you will." The following morning, I went into my bank in York. The young cashier smiled politely. "What is the payment for today?" "Private loan, to family. A friend." She glanced at the amount before looking back at me. "I ask whether you've met this person." The question caught me off guard. Why? Encouraged to check when customers are sending larger overseas payments. It isn't a scam. It wasn't suggesting it was. It certainly sounded like you were. I felt my face grow warm. I'd spent my entire working life making careful decisions, checking every signal, following every safety procedure. I wasn't some confused old man who couldn't recognize genuine affection. The cashier apologized gently. "Only have to ask." The transfer went through. That evening, Claire rang in tears. "You've saved me. I've only helped. I'll never forget this." For the first time, she called me something she never had before. "My dear David." Hearing those words filled the empty corners of the house more completely than I care to admit. 3 days later, she rang again. Banking review had taken longer than expected. The solicitor had discovered another fee. "I can't believe this. It'll soon be over." "Hope so." Again, she never actually asked. Again, I offered. This time, the amount was £6 I hesitated. Not because I doubted her, because it was considerably more money. Claire immediately sensed the change. "It's all right. I'll find another way. I don't want you sacrificing your savings." A few hours later, she sent a photograph of herself sitting alone in what she said was an airport cafe. Her eyes looked red. Beside the picture, she wrote, "T. I thought I'd finally be flying home tonight." I stared at the image for several minutes. Then I logged into my account to avoid touching the savings Margaret and I had built for later life, cashed in part of a small investment bond. She'd always insisted we should keep untouched. Signing those papers hurt more than transferring the money. It felt as though I was undoing one of Margaret's final plans for us. "Confessed that to Claire," she answered immediately. "Margaret loved you. She wouldn't want you spending the rest of your life alone." Those words removed the last of my hesitation. A week later, Claire called once more. This time her voice was filled with panic. "Can't pay as 8.750 within 48 hours. They'll seize the estate." She promised that once everything was released, she'd repay every penny and come straight back to England. The next morning, I booked an appointment at my bank. I picked up my coat to leave the house. The doorbell rang. Standing on the step was James. He held a familiar envelope in his hand. "Dad," he said quietly, "why have you withdrawn money from the investment? Mom wanted you to keep for your future care." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Tabis. James was still standing in the hallway, holding the envelope from the investment company. I hadn't even realized I'd left it on the hall table. "Come in," I said quietly. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and placed the envelope on the kitchen worktop. Kettle had only just boiled. Without thinking, I filled 2 mugs. The familiar routine almost made everything feel normal. Almost. James wrapped his hands around the tea, but didn't drink it. "Dad," he said gently, "why have you taken money out of Mom's investment bond?" Kept my eyes on the steam rising from my mug. "I needed it." "For what?" "It's temporary." "How temporary?" I hesitated. "Claire sorting out her sister's estate. And she'll pay me back." James nodded slowly. "How much have you already sent?" "Not much." He looked at me for several seconds. Please, don't, I said. I felt my face burn. It started with a loan. Dad, she didn't ask. I offered. How much? The question hung in the air. Finally, I whispered. Just over 10,000. James closed his eyes, not dramatically, just for a second, as though he needed that moment before speaking again. Oh, Dad, it's not what you think. I hope it isn't. He looked around the kitchen, the room where Mom had baked birthday cakes, the table where we'd all eaten Christmas dinner, the place where I taught him how to repair a broken toaster when he was 12. Don't care about the money. You must. I honestly don't. You've suddenly appeared. The moment I touched my savings, the expression changed. The hurt in his eyes stopped me for a moment. Is that really what you think of me? Don't know what to think anymore. James took a slow breath. Dad, if you spent every penny tomorrow, it wouldn't change how often I'd visit. Wouldn't it? No. His voice became quieter. I'd rather you had nothing left than lose yourself to someone who's lying to you. I looked away. She isn't lying. You don't know that. I do. You hope that. The distinction annoyed me far more than it should have. I'd like to. I'll ask. Bah. The answer came so quickly that it surprised even me. James noticed. Why not? Because she's already anxious. So am I. Rubbed my forehead. She doesn't want to feel interrogated. Neither would I. He reached across the table and gently touched my arm. Dad, I thought those Sunday phone calls were enough. I frowned. What do you mean? I kept asking if you were all right. You always said you were. What else was I supposed to say? James swallowed hard. I thought giving you space was respectful. Looked down into his untouched tea. I never imagined it felt like abandonment. The word landed heavily between us. Abandonment. I hadn't used it myself, but hearing James say it made something inside me shift. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then my phone buzzed. Claire. He answered immediately. Hello. Her voice sounded unusually cautious. Is everything all right? James is here. There was a brief silence. Oh, he wants to meet you. Another pause. I don't think that's a good idea. Why not? Don't want to be judged by someone who's already decided. I'm taking advantage of you. He only wants to understand. Spent years being misunderstood. Her voice began to tremble. If he starts questioning me, I'll only become upset. I glanced at James. Sure he does. But families don't always welcome new people. She sighed softly. Sometimes they're frightened of losing control. The sentence settled into my mind before I realized what she was doing. They think I'm after your money. I never said that. You didn't have to. I'm frightened they'll persuade you to stop speaking to me. Finally found someone who understands me. So have. Please don't let anyone take that away. When the call ended, James looked at me sadly. She wouldn't speak to me. She's nervous. He shook his head. She's avoiding me, making assumptions. I'm asking questions. So am I. Instead of arguing further, James opened his laptop. Let's forget opinions. Stick to facts. Where exactly was Claire born? In Surrey. Which town? I'm not sure. It was her husband's full name. Peter. I searched my memory. Nothing came. What school did she work at? The one near Guildford. Which one? He asked another. Who's handling the estate? A solicitor. Name it? I couldn't remember. Each answer seemed to disappear the moment I reached for it. James. Remained calm. Then he asked one final question. Dad, is Claire's surname? The kitchen suddenly felt only said, asterisk, Claire M. Every email ended simply, Key Claire. Passport she'd shown me. Her thumb had covered the surname. Even the bank account belonged to someone called *M. Okafor. Stared at the table. Neither of us spoke. After a long silence, James quietly said, "Please, hours. If I can't prove she's lying, you'll never mention it again." Against every instinct, I nodded. Together, uploaded one of Claire's photographs into a reverse image search. The results appeared within seconds. The same smiling face. Not in Surrey, in France. But on the public social media page of a retired woman living in New Zealand. Different name, different life. Married, never widowed, never lived in Surrey. I shook my head. There has to be an explanation. Before James could answer, my phone rang. Claire looked from the screen to the photograph on James's laptop. Then I answered. Her voice was urgent. "David, the deadline's changed. Money has to be sent within the hour." My heart began to race. Would I believe the evidence lying in front of me? The voice that had quietly filled every lonely evening since November? My hand was trembling so badly that I nearly dropped the phone, pressed it to my ear. "Hello, David," Claire sounded breathless. "I've just spoken to the solicitor." I looked across the kitchen table. James didn't interrupt. He simply turned the laptop slightly, so I could still see the photograph of the smiling woman from New Zealand. "Bank has delayed everything again," Claire continued. "If the payment doesn't arrive today, they'll freeze the estate completely." I closed my eyes. "Claire, I know this is awful. I've done everything I can, I know you have." Her voice softened. "I hate asking this of you." I swallowed. "The bank won't release the transfer until they've carried out a few checks." There was a brief silence. Then she spoke more urgently. "They don't understand. No, they're treating me as though I'm some sort of criminal." I looked at James. He remained silent, letting me speak. "Claire, what? I need to ask you something." Another pause. "What is it?" The line became completely still. For several seconds, could hear was faint static. Then she gave a nervous little laugh. "Is that really important now?" "Yes, David, honestly, is it?" Another silence. Finally she answered. "Morrison." The name meant nothing to me. James was already typing. Within seconds, he shook his head, almost imperceptibly. Nothing, no connection to the teaching assistant she'd described. No link to Surrey. Trace of the story I'd heard for nearly 3 months. I tried again. "What's the name of the solicitor dealing with your sister's estate?" I stated. "It's Harrison and Cole." James immediately searched. The firm existed, found the official number, and quietly dialed it on his own mobile while I stayed on the call. A receptionist answered. James moved only a few feet away, but I could hear enough. "No, I'm just trying to confirm a client." A short pause. "I'm looking for Claire Morrison." Another pause. "I see." He thanked her politely and ended the call. He looked directly at me, slowly shook his head. The firm had never heard of her. My mouth suddenly felt dry. "Claire, what? They don't know you." Her breathing changed. "You've called them." Instantly, her tone hardened. I knew this was about him. "It isn't. Poisoning everything. No, he doesn't want you to be happy." I looked at James. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't trying to take the phone away. He simply stood there, waiting. Claire began crying, not loudly, just enough for me to hear each shaky breath. "I've only ever wanted one thing." "What?" "Someone who cared whether I got home safely." The words struck me like a physical blow. Only weeks earlier, I'd stood alone in my hallway after the neighbor's birthday party, realizing nobody had asked me to let them know. I'd arrived home. I'd told Claire that story. Now she was giving it back to me. Exactly, for one terrible moment. I nearly apologized. I nearly told James to leave. Then he quietly walked over and placed Margaret's framed photograph on the table beside my phone. He didn't interrupt. He simply spoke in the calmest voice I'd ever heard. "Dad." I looked up. "Mom loved you for 38 years. I felt my throat tighten. "She never asked you to keep secrets." He paused. "She never demanded money." Another pause. "She never made you choose between her and the people who loved you." The kitchen fell silent. I took a slow breath. "Claire." "Yes, this is all genuine." "It is." "Turn your camera on." "My excuses." She said nothing. "Hold up today's newspaper. Write today's date on a piece of paper." The silence lasted almost 10 seconds. Then the call ended. No goodbye. No explanation. Just silence. Immediately, I tried calling back. The call wouldn't connect. Her WhatsApp profile picture disappeared. The little status beneath her name vanished. Within minutes, her account no longer existed. I opened my email. My latest message bounced back undelivered. 3 months of conversations had disappeared in less than 5 minutes. I wasn't crying because I'd lost money. Not yet. I was grieving someone who had never existed. Everything I'd felt had been real. The comfort, the hope, the excitement. Only the person receiving those feelings had been invented. Later that afternoon, James drove me back to the bank. Maria Shah welcomed us into the same consultation room. She didn't look at me with pity. She looked at me with kindness. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Mercer. Should have known." She gently shook her head. "No, people like this don't succeed because their victims are unintelligent." Folded her hands. "They succeed because they study loneliness, grief, and trust. They build a relationship first. The fraud comes later." She explained that my first 2 transfers had already moved through several accounts. The final payment, however, had been stopped in time. Investigators believed the recipient account formed part of a much larger romance fraud network, using money mules across Britain and overseas. Priya completed the paperwork. James quietly searched through Claire's old messages. Several phrases appeared, almost word for word, on public grief forums for widows and widowers. Being the comfort I believed was uniquely mine had been carefully borrowed. A few weeks later, detectives confirmed that at least 6 other victims had spoken to someone using the same photographs and almost identical stories. One man in Kent had lost nearly £40,000. When the investigating officer asked whether I'd provide every message, recording and email I'd kept, I agreed. Before handing over my phone, I listened once to Claire's final voice message. "Don't let anyone make you doubt what we have." This time, I pressed delete. The weeks that followed moved more slowly than I thought possible. Once, the police had taken copies of my messages, bank records, and call history. There was very little for me to do, except wait. The first few days, I barely left the house. Every corner reminded me of Claire. The chair where I had sat during our evening calls had carefully cleared. The notebook beside the telephone filled with little reminders. Ask Claire about Whitby. Justus recommended tea room near the Minster. Find Margaret's lemon drizzle recipe. Peach note felt like evidence collected from a life that had never really existed. I almost threw the notebook into the bin. Instead, closed it and placed it in a drawer. Not because I wanted to remember Claire. Because I wanted to remember how easily hope can disguise itself as certainty. James visited every Saturday. He never once said, "Told you so." For that alone, I was deeply grateful. Instead, he brought practical things. Fresh bread, a newspaper, replacement bird feeder after the old one finally split in the frost. Sometimes we hardly spoke at all. Trimmed the hedge while I swept the leaves. We worked side by side, saying only what needed to be said. Reminded me of the years when he was a boy and we repaired bicycles together in the garage. Comfort doesn't always arrive through conversation. Sometimes it arrives through quiet company. 3 weeks after my final meeting with Priya, Detective Sergeant Collins telephoned. I thought you'd like an update, Mr. Mercer. I sat down immediately. We've identified several bank accounts linked to the payments. Does that mean you found Claire? There was a pause. I'm afraid not. He explained that there had probably never been a Claire. The voice I'd heard belonged to someone using disposable phones and false identities. The photographs had been stolen from social media accounts years earlier. Payments traveled through several temporary accounts before disappearing overseas within hours. We've frozen part of the final transfer. The others. I'm sorry. I already knew the answer before he spoke it. The money was gone. Detective Collins continued. Your evidence has helped us. 7 victims who believed they were speaking to different women. 7. So far. One widower from Norfolk had sold his caravan. Another retired teacher in Devon had emptied almost every savings account he owned. Former nurse from Lancashire had borrowed against her home because she believed she was helping the man she planned to marry. Stories were different. The loneliness behind them was almost identical. Before ending the call, the detective asked something unexpected. We're organizing an awareness evening with local banks and community groups. I see. Would you consider speaking? I laughed bitterly. You want me to stand in front of strangers and admit I was fooled? I'd like people to hear the truth from someone they recognize. I don't think I'm the right person. You may be exactly the right person. For several days, I ignored the invitation. Priya telephoned. I heard the police have been in touch. They have. I don't think I can do it. I understand, he stated before adding. May I tell you something? Of course. In the last year alone, I've spoken to dozens of customers in similar situations. Dozens? Some listened, some didn't. Her voice became quieter. The ones who listened usually had one thing in common. What? Someone had been brave enough to tell their own story first. That sentence stayed with me. A fortnight later, I found myself standing in a modest community hall in York. There were perhaps 40 people. Retired couples, widows, adult children who had persuaded aging parents to attend. My hands shook as I walked to the front. For a moment I considered turning around. Instead, I looked across the room and simply told the truth. My name is David Mercer, 69. I spent 40 years making sure trains traveled safely. A few gentle smiles appeared. Believed careful people couldn't be deceived. I paused. I was wrong. For the next 20 minutes, I described exactly what had happened. The money first. The loneliness, the routine, the comfort. The slow building of trust. How the first request never felt like a request. How every doubt was answered with reassurance. How embarrassment kept me silent, even when questions began forming in my own mind. When I finished, they looked down on me. An elderly gentleman in the second row slowly stood. My wife died 3 years ago. Cleared his throat. I've been talking to someone online myself. The room became perfectly still. I was planning to send money next week. His daughter reached across and quietly took his hand. Another woman admitted she'd received similar messages. Then another. What I had believed was my private shame turned out to be frighteningly common. Afterwards, several people thanked me. The widower embraced me without saying a word. As everyone began leaving, Priya walked over carrying 2 paper cups of tea. Did more good tonight than you probably realize. I nearly didn't come, I know. She smiled warmly. But you did. The first time since Margaret died. I realized that perhaps my loneliness could still protect someone else's future. And somehow, felt like the beginning of something worth living for again. Nearly 6 months passed before I opened the drawer again. Small notebook was still there. So was the printed railway timetable. Claire had once asked me to explain. For a long time, I simply looked at them. Then, I smiled. Not because the memories no longer hurt, but because they no longer controlled me. Some wounds never disappear completely. They simply stop deciding how tomorrow will feel. A spring arrived slowly in York. The daffodils appeared along the city walls. The market grew busier. Tourists returned to the shambles, king with maps in one hand and cameras in the other. Life carried on. So did I. James began visiting more often. Not because he felt guilty, because we had both realized how easily love can be mistaken for independence. One Sunday afternoon he brought Emily and Oliver. Grandchildren burst into the house, carrying muddy football boots and far too much energy. Within minutes, the sitting room looked wonderfully untidy. Oliver pointed towards Margaret's old record player. "Granddad, does it still work?" "It certainly does." We spent the next hour listening to records that hadn't been played in years. Billy laughed at how enormous the vinyl discs looked. Oliver tried to copy the dances Margaret and I used to do around this very room. The first time in years, the house sounded alive again. As they prepared to leave, Emily hugged me tightly. "You smile more now." Children notice things adults often miss after they had gone. James stayed behind. He helped you wash the dishes before standing quietly beside the kitchen window. "I'm sorry, Dad." "What for?" "Thought protecting you meant asking questions." "It did. I should have visited more before any of this happened." I shook my head. "We're both trying our best." He looked relieved. "I don't want us to drift apart again." "We won't. This time I believed it." Few weeks later, Detective Sergeant Collins telephoned one final time. "I thought you'd appreciate an update." The investigation had led to several arrests, involving money mules operating in Britain. Although the organizers remained overseas, the network had been disrupted. Some frozen funds were being returned to victims. A month later, I received a letter from my bank. All of my money had been recovered. Far from it. Part of the final transfer, and a small portion from an earlier payment, had been successfully traced before disappearing abroad. It wasn't enough to erase the financial loss. It was enough to remind me that people had not simply abandoned my case once the headlines disappeared. Priya Shah called shortly afterwards. "I've got some good news. I've already heard." "No," she laughed. "Not that." "What then?" "Our awareness evenings have expanded." "Really?" "We've held sessions across North Yorkshire. And?" She smiled through the telephone. "Several people recognized your story." Stomach tightened. "I hope that isn't embarrassing." She paused. 2 customers walked away from suspicious online relationships because they remembered something you said. "What was that?" "Search my memory." She answered for me. "Real love never asks you to hide it from the people who already love you." I'd almost forgotten saying those words. Apparently, someone else hadn't. That evening, after dinner, I walked through the back garden, carrying a small packet of yellow rosy plants. Margaret had always believed there was room for one more rose. I dug carefully into the soft earth beside the older bushes. When the final plant was in place, I stood back and wiped the soil from my hands. "Think you'd approve," I said quietly. The breeze moved gently through the garden. There was no answer. There didn't need to be. For the first time since losing Margaret, speaking aloud no longer came from unbearable loneliness. It came from gratitude. 3 months later, I received an invitation to speak at another fraud awareness event. This time, I accepted immediately. After the meeting, an elderly gentleman waited until everyone else had left. My wife died last year, he said. I nearly joined one of those dating sites. Smiled awkwardly. Still might one day looked surprised. You do. Loneliness shouldn't become a life sentence. Smiled. But promise me something. What? If someone truly cares about you, Porchi, they'll never ask you to choose between your heart and your judgment. He nodded thoughtfully, before shaking my hand. I walked home through the quiet streets of York. I realized something important. Claire had stolen money. She had stolen months of my life. She had even stolen my confidence for a while. But she had failed to steal the one thing that mattered most. My ability to trust wisely again. Blindly, not fearfully, wisely. I still believed companionship was possible. I still believed kindness existed. Still believed that even after heartbreak, life could surprise us for the better. The difference was that I now understood something. I wished I'd known from the beginning. Love grows stronger in the light. Exception survives only in the dark. So if my story reaches even one person sitting alone this evening, wondering whether the stranger on the screen is too good to be true, then perhaps every painful lesson was not wasted, because no amount of loneliness is worth surrendering your dignity. No genuine love will ever ask you to risk everything before it is willing to show you the truth. If there's one lesson I carry with me now, it's this. Ask the difficult questions. Share your hopes with the people who already care about you. And never mistake secrecy for romance. Sometimes the simplest question can save an entire future.